Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Dalia Ghanem. I am a resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center, where I focus on North Africa, political Islam, and jihadism. And I have great honor to welcome today a dear colleague who came all the way from China to talk about China. So Paul Haenle holds the Maurice Greenberg Director Chair at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center based at Tsinghua University. And he teaches also at the university undergraduate and graduate level courses to Chinese and international students. And today we are here to pick up his brain on a very important matter and country that is China. So, Paul, how have you seen China's foreign policy evolve over your time working on China in the Bush and Obama administration to now as director of the Carnegie Tsinghua Center in Beirut? This is the best Chinese accent that I can make.
You said it perfectly,
So.
Carnegie Tsinghua. No, thank you very much. First of all, I just want to thank you and my Carnegie colleagues from the Carnegie Center here in Beirut. This is my second time to visit Beirut. I came to this forum 2 years ago and participated. Last year, my wife had a baby girl in October, and so I could not leave her. But she's 1 year old now, and my wife gave me a permission slip to leave and come here. So it's a pleasure to come here. I always enjoy coming here, and I find it's remarkable. During the discussions, the last time I was here, I don't think China came up at all. But today I've heard China a few times, especially in this last panel, talking about China's economic model, and I hope we can get into some of that during this discussion. But Dalia, as you mentioned, I've been working on China issues at Carnegie now for close to 10 years. Prior to that, I spent 5 years in the National Security Councils of President Bush, Bush 43, the son, not old enough to have worked for his father, and President Obama. And so, had an opportunity to watch China evolve over the years as an issue, its own international strategy. And I was watching yesterday the funeral of President George Herbert Walker Bush, and he has played a very important role on U.S.-China relations going back to the time when he was our first envoy in China in the 1970s, and then, of course, as vice president and then president 1988 to 1992. But we have to remember that relationship with China was unbelievably different than the relationship we have with China today. George Herbert Walker Bush probably worked on economic and trade issues, but certainly not to the scale and scope that we're talking about them today. Probably did some sort of people-to-people things, probably raised uncomfortable with the Chinese issues of human rights. Pretty much just bilateral issues. When I joined the George W. administration in 2004, it was at a time period where China's economic growth had given it greater influence and power in the world. And what was remarkable to me, just to give you kind of an anecdote of a practical example of how China's influence grew because of its economic achievements since its reform and opening up in the late 70s, but really that didn't take part. I think it really didn't take off until several years after Tiananmen Square, probably in the late 90s and certainly throughout the early 2000s. When I would prepare the president, whether it's President Bush or President Obama, for a phone call or a meeting with the Chinese president, I would, of course, put in all the bilateral issues into the memo, into my briefing. But I noticed a trend, and that trend was that my colleagues from around the National Security Council that were working on other regional or functional issues were coming to me very excited, saying, if you don't include something in your memo to the president in my area, whether that's non-proliferation, climate change, Iran nuclear issues, Sudan, counterterrorism, I mean, the list goes on. By the time I would get done with memos for the president, they'd be pages long. And it's just a sort of very manifestation that China started becoming important in a lot of issues. And we had to decide as an administration how to deal with that. And so our strategy was to try to engage China in areas where we thought we could build greater cooperation, especially the areas around the global set of issues where they had more influence. And in many cases, we had common interests. But we also recognized that we had a set of disagreements. We have a different political system. They ran their economy differently, human rights, and other issues. And we didn't shy away from those. We tried to deal with those. And that was sort of the framework with which we came at it. And I would just say that China also has had an evolution on the international front. They've gone from, under Deng Xiaoping, he had a dictum called Tao Guang Yang Hui, which basically translates into keeping a low profile internationally, biding your time and hiding your capabilities. And so China, as a deliberate strategy on the international side, did not want to get too involved in international issues, wanted to focus at home on its domestic development and growing its economy. And that's still true to a large part today. But we saw a change in that, especially after the global financial crisis in 2008. And we Americans call it the global financial crisis. The Chinese deliberately call it the U.S. financial crisis to make it known their view that we caused that. But that, I think, was a powerful moment for them. They always saw the way we ran our economy as very superior to any ideas that they had. And I think we as Americans took a hit, and that gave China more confidence. That was also the year that they had their Beijing Olympics, which they call, they're sort of opening up to the world party. Now, under President Xi Jinping, who's been in power 5 years, they have officially left the low-profile strategy Tao Guang Yang Hui behind. And he has come forward, Xi Jinping, with a very new strategy called Feng Fa Zuowei, which means strive for achievement, that China should strive for achievement in the international sphere. And that's what you see now with China. And so it's a very different relationship that the U.S. now has with China, and frankly, that the world now has with China.
So what is motivating the changes in China's foreign policy, and how would you characterize Beijing international approach today?
I think China, some of the themes that President Xi, who's a very different leader than the previous two leaders, have put forward are the China dream and the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This idea that after a century of humiliation by foreign powers, China now is coming back. And that gives Chinese people a great sense of pride. And so what I think the Chinese leadership is looking for is, as it takes into account its growing and greater today comprehensive national power and influence around the world, it wants to have a position, whether that's in international institutions or in other international fora, commensurate with what it sees as its enhanced power. And I think that largely is what China is striving for. For many years, I think they were trying to integrate into the international system. We saw that with the WTO. China was reluctant at first, and we encouraged China to join the WTO. And the idea was to try to get China into the systems of the international system, make them a part, get their skin in the game. And I think largely they're still doing that, but they're now also doing something else, which is they're trying to shape the international system to conform to an international system that's more beneficial to China. And so that's a bit of a change. If you watched last year in 2017 at the 19th Party Congress, President Xi Jinping gave a 3.5-hour speech. And while most of it was about domestic development, because again, I think the considerable bulk of their focus does remain domestic. I think people forget that, given they have such an ambitious international approach today. But they are really domestic focused. But in his speech, he made some very, very important comments. He talked about China's three phases of its development. And he said that under Mao Zedong, the revolutionary leader, the Chinese people stood up, and under Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese people became rich. And he called this a new era, and he said under this era, of course under his leadership, Xi Jinping's leadership, the nation is becoming strong. And I'll tell you, as a political message, that's pretty compelling for Chinese citizens, and they can get their head around this idea. And so as a part of that, he has put forward a very ambitious international strategy, which includes things like the Belt and Road Initiative and other issues. But that's where it's all coming from. I think that's what's driving this new international approach.
So you said that the focus remains domestic. However, what are Chinese foreign policy priorities today? I mean, if we have to talk about China's priorities on the global stage in areas of security, economy, trade, and so on and so forth, what are these priorities?
So I kind of see them in sort of three different buckets. First, I think is the domestic, as you said. It's really the idea of keeping the party together. That is first and foremost in the Chinese people's mind, which is how do we maintain that internal stability, keep the people happy, and make sure that the party is in power. And that is by far the most important. There are parts of that which I see as domestic, but many people may see as outside of China, but they deal with issues of China's sovereignty. And so part of this question of China's internal stability is, can they keep the country unified and together? And this is where I think the South China Sea comes in. We saw during the ending period of the Obama administration where the Chinese really took steps to assertively and aggressively state their claims and built islands in the South China Sea around those claims, despite the international pushback, because this is very important for any Chinese leader, that the Chinese claims these islands as Chinese territory, and no leader can appear to be weak. And then Taiwan, of course, is also part of that, as is Tibet and Xinjiang, parts of China that could ultimately, be lost, and if they were lost, it could mean the downfall of the Communist Party. Second, I think, is moving China to the center of global activity, which is something else that Xi Jinping mentioned in his 19th Party speech. And here, the most obvious example of that is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is hugely ambitious, especially if you think about it with the backdrop of 30 years of keeping a low profile. For them to come out of the starting box with this hugely ambitious project, which involves 65 plus developing countries, and now it basically covers, I think, every part of the world. I saw recently Antarctica was part of it, and then when the North Korean leader met with the Chinese leader, they threw North Korea in there. So I think it covers basically every part of the world. But it is about building infrastructure and doing projects in those companies to help with the economic development. But if done well, it will, of course, enhance China's own strategic influence in the world. It will give them greater geopolitical power. And, of course, if it's not done well, then the adverse is also true. And so while China has integrated into many of the systems that have been around for several decades, they're starting to build their own. And one Chinese scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences put it this way at an event at the Carnegie Center in Beijing recently. He said, "We see the international system as a system of temples, and we will build new temples like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank or the Belt and Road. We will try to repair old temples like the World Trade Organization or organizations like the IMF or the World Bank to try to give China more say into those organizations, but we won't knock down temples." And in this case, it's also interesting. They make they point out a distinction between China in this regard and Russia, their friend Russia, who they say Russia would be willing to knock down all the temples. I don't know if Dimitri is here, but I find that very interesting that the Chinese are suggesting that they will abide by the current international system, but they want to modify things and they may want to build their own uh, uh, institutions to participate in that. So I think, and then of course on the economic side, the Communist Party will, in addition to the sovereignty issues, what's so important to maintain the position of the Communist Party is the continued economic growth in China and improving the livelihoods of Chinese people. And right now, the Chinese economy is experiencing a slowdown. Markets have also been hit, and that causes great concern to the Chinese. But in this bucket of issues that I think the leadership is focused on, what comes into play is something we've been talking about earlier today, and that is those issues around the frontier technology areas. And this is where China sees the future being defined. And they launched a strategy or an initiative or a plan called Made in China 2025, which basically laid out the Chinese plan to take the commanding heights of several of the different areas of technology, whether it's robotics or artificial intelligence or quantum computing. And that caught the attention of not only the Americans, but friends in Europe and in Asia. And I think the thing to understand about this when I talk to Chinese experts or Chinese government officials is I don't think it's countries outside of China saying you cannot compete in those areas, or you can't move up the value chain, or you can't try to develop indigenously your own technology in these areas. The question is, how do we compete fairly about these? And this gets into the structure of China's economy, which was talked about on the last panel. Over the last few years, it's become much more of a state-driven economy where the government will give out large subsidies and will support the development of those frontier technologies. And what countries say, including the United States, and this is a huge part of the tension between the US and China, is those kind of subsidies and that kind of government intervention distort the global economy and don't allow companies around the world to compete fairly. And I think this is, in my own view, this will be the issue of great tension between the United States and China and the United States and the rest of the world. Because it's not just a U.S. issue. It is, as I said, there's international common concern about this issue. And at the G20 and in the current trade war between the United States and China, this is smack dab in the middle of all that. When you hear about the 301 report, this contains all of the concerns that the U.S. has around these areas of technology. It also addresses the intellectual property issue and this idea that Chinese companies will force other companies to turn over their IP or their technology for access to get into the country and to get to the Chinese market. And so this is a big area for China. They see it as defining the future. I think America and other countries around do as well. And in my view, this is really where the greatest tension going forward we'll see in the economic space.
I would like to come back to a point that you mentioned earlier, North Korea. It is an area in which the US and China have had both cooperation and disagreement. Having previously served as the White House representative to the six-party talks, how do you view recent developments and diplomacy?
Well, China plays a big role with respect to North Korea. And as you mentioned, Dalia, I was the White House representative to the six-party talks from 2007 to 2009. And that was a time period where we had great cooperation with China. And as a result, we made some progress. Unfortunately, we did not solve the issue back then. I think largely that was because the North Korean leader died in the middle of our, or suffered a stroke and died later in the middle of our negotiations. And after he had a stroke, Kim Jong-il The North Koreans left the six-party talks. And then the Sun has taken on a very different approach. But the kind of cooperation we would have with the Chinese, I thought at the time was establishing patterns of cooperation with China that we were hoping could be replicated in other areas as we build greater cooperation with China on global issues. I mean, I traveled to North Korea half a dozen times to meet with North Koreans in negotiations. We would go with a small delegation very quietly into the country, and we always stopped to meet with the Chinese. And when we met with our Chinese counterparts, we'd often say, here's the talking points we're going to use. And, a lot of times the Chinese would say, why are you going to use those? That doesn't make a lot of sense. I said, well, why don't you think it makes sense? And we would have an actual sort of back and forth. We didn't always take their recommendations, but the end product was better. And coming out, we would explain to our Chinese counterparts what we heard and what we thought it meant. And the Chinese counterparts would say, well, why do you think it means that? But we were having that exchange, which is so critical in diplomacy to try to better understand. We don't have a monopoly on understanding what the North Koreans mean when they say certain things. And in some ways, the Chinese, having fought a war with them and having a border with them, understand them much better. We were cooperating with the Chinese at the early days of the Trump administration, up with the maximum pressure campaign, up until about a year ago. A year ago, Kim Jong-un had really ramped up his missile exercises and his nuclear tests, and it was really causing the Chinese leadership a lot of frustration and anger, frankly. And I was hearing anecdotal stories from friends at different agencies within China, including the military establishment, that the leader of China, was really angry at Kim Jong-un. And Chinese leaders will tell you that a year ago this time, the North Koreans, during 2017, when the Chinese had their big Belt and Road Forum, which was extremely important to Xi Jinping, during the keynote speech given by President Xi, the North Koreans launched a series of missiles. That was not appreciated by the Chinese leadership. And then in September of that year, the Chinese were hosting the BRICS summit in Xiamen in China. During President Xi's keynote speech, the Chinese did their largest nuclear test ever, a hydrogen bomb, and right during the middle of Xi Jinping's speech. And then in November, the North Koreans successfully tested a Hwasong-15 long-range intercontinental ballistic missile. And those series of tests give the North Koreans a minimum capability. You can't count out the fact that they might be able to hit allies in the region or the United States. And the maximum pressure campaign at that point was extremely strong. And Chinese experts were concerned that North Koreans were coming close to a red line, a Chinese red line, that if they were to go over that red line, that the Chinese leadership would fundamentally have to put much more pressure on North Korea to the point that the regime would implode. These were the kind of conversations we were having with the North Koreans. After the nuclear test in September, it caused an earthquake in the northeast part of China. And citizens up in the northeast part of China were worried about radioactive fallout coming into the north part of China. And, this is the kind of thing that the Chinese leadership really worries about, because if it's not protecting the Chinese people, then ultimately they could find themselves exposed. But what changed was when Donald Trump indicated that he would be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un. And it was very interesting because I had a lot of officials and experts, Chinese, that came to me and said, this is wonderful that Donald Trump is willing to speak to Kim Jong-un, because we've always said it takes dialogue to solve the problem. But the next day, the Chinese had an epiphany that Donald Trump is so unpredictable that it's possible he could do some sort of grand bargain with North Korea at a time where China's relationship with North Korea is in many ways the worst it's ever been in history. And the leadership thought, that's not in our interest. And so you remember Kim Jong-un then traveled to Beijing and met with Xi Jinping, surprised everybody. And they've since met 2 more times. And oh, by the way, the 2 additional times that they met were right before Secretary of State Pompeo met with Kim Jong-un. So the China and North Korea relationship is shored back up, and Chinese now are pressing for a relief in sanctions. But the Trump administration is not getting anywhere on denuclearization. And so we potentially will have problems going forward. Last thing I'll say is I'm not a big fan of what President Trump accomplished at the Singapore summit. He went in with very high objectives, which were in many cases the right objectives, but he came out with a very vague statement. It's very unclear what commitments the North Koreans made on denuclearization, and he gave away a lot of things. He gave away our joint military exercises with the South Koreans. And on top of that, he called them provocative war games, which is what the North Koreans and the Chinese call them. We call them legitimate military exercises that we do with our important ally in the region to prevent war. I only say that I wish we had these joint military training exercises in 1950. We may have headed off the first Korean War. They're important, and he shouldn't have given them away. When I asked Department of Defense officials, did you know Trump was going to give those away? They say, not only did we not know he was going to give them away, the North Koreans didn't ask for it. So it's a little strange to me, the outcome. And the last thing I'll say is the Chinese are delighted with the outcome, because it's exactly the outcome the Chinese had been suggesting for a year before that, called a dual freeze, where the U.S. stands down on its military exercises with South Korea, and North Korea refrained from testing missiles and nuclear devices. And the U.S. government pushed back aggressively on that, but yet somehow Donald Trump, that's where he ended. And now he's told the American people that the nuclear problem is over with North Korea, but far from it. The North Koreans are actually developing more nuclear fuel. They're building up their missile arsenal. They're doing a lot of things right now to give them a stronger nuclear program. And we haven't even gotten to the question of who will they proliferate that to. So I think the situation is actually more dangerous today than it was before the Singapore summit in many ways. And I don't think we've reached the right outcome at the Singapore summit.
So let us move a bit and turn to this region. So I have several questions. First of all, what has characterized China's engagement in the Middle East and North Africa? And how does China's engagement in the MENA region fit into its broader international approach? And finally, what are where did China succeed and where did it fail?
I think the way I would describe China's Middle East approach is here we still actually see in many ways China's what I call Tao Guangyang Hui, low profile, keep out of, when you get to the political elements and the security challenges in the region, China doesn't really want anything to do with those. But they've moved to this, fun fa zuo way, realize achievements in the economic, commercial, and energy space. And here's where the Belt and Road fits in, because the Middle East in the Chinese concept of the Belt and Road is very important. And you're already seeing signs of greater Chinese investment, building infrastructure. Dalia, you wrote a very good article about Algeria, and that was 2 years ago, talking about just the astronomical jump in investment by China in Algeria. And it ranges things from, schools, prisons, government buildings, Olympic stadiums, shopping malls, a $3 billion project for the port in Algeria.
And the mosque, the famous mosque.
Famous mosque, exactly. And the Chinese come in many cases with their own workers and using their state-owned enterprises. And this is just, one example. and you're seeing that throughout the region. So I think the Belt and Road is a very important part of them building that connectivity, developing those commercial ties, which will ultimately benefit China. The argument they use is it will also be good for the stability of the regime of the region, because at the root cause of the instability is economic opportunities, and we're creating economic opportunities. So that's a big part. I think on the political side, we are seeing a little bit more from the Chinese, and I think that some of that is simply they don't like to be criticized for not playing an important role. You see them go around the region and establish partnerships with many countries in the region. They now have 3 comprehensive strategic partnerships. That's the highest level of diplomatic definition you can have. It's with Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Those are the highest level of a diplomatic relationship that you could have. They have announced, the foreign ministry has envoys to Syria, and they have an envoy to the Middle East. And I think that's trying to demonstrate their concerns about what's happening in Syria, and so they want to, from a diplomatic standpoint, have something that shows their concern. They've organized conferences around Syria, and they've done the same thing with the Middle East around Israel-Palestine issues. They've joined in on the anti-piracy operations outside of the region. And then on Syria, they did jump in using a Chinese frigate to help move some of the chemical weapons out in 2014. But I would not expect any Chinese boots on the ground in the Middle East for quite a long time. And I think there's 2 primary reasons for that. One is there's actually, I think, a sincere feeling in China that they don't have the capacity or the capability to be able to do that. They haven't operated so far from China, and their military is not trained enough. But secondly, I think they don't really want to get embroiled in some of what that might bring. They do not want to get tangled up in regional rivalries. The most important thing when you talk to the Chinese about their Middle East policy, the greatest source of pride is that they have good relations with every country. And that makes sense if you think about it from an economic, commercial, and an energy standpoint. Why would it pay to get in the middle of a rivalry between 2 powers? And they try very hard to stay out of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I have several other questions, as does the audience, I believe. So I'm going to give the floor and open the Q&A. So please, we have 10 minutes left.
Okay, I guess my question is, recently China did its first import expo. It's one of a kind. And I think it's mainly to promote the One Belt, One Road initiative. What is the US doing to keep up with this initiative? And in view of the sanctions and the current Trump, if you want, administration, what is the US doing to counter that move? Thank you.
You mentioned the import exposition in Shanghai. But then you talked about the Belt and Road. What is the U.S. doing with respect to the Belt and Road? Is that the question?
The first is, since the initiative was the first expo or import expo, which basically promotes the One Belt, One Road, these 2 coupled do create some kind of traction in the economic landscape for China.
Yeah.
How is the U.S. countering that?
Got it.
So you.
Yes, hi, my name is Rabab Obeid. I'm an independent researcher. We met the Chinese ambassador at the Lebanese university, and there he was asked the question about the road and belt, and he said that it's more of a concept than a physical thing, because though he brought with him some maps, but these maps really didn't show much. So now we understand that the road and belt is a concept of economic relations. That's it, as wide as can be. I really wonder when you mention that China has important economic relations in this region with Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. I wonder this port in Haifa that China is planning to have, is it going to be, in your expectation, something local with um, the Zionist, um, or it's going to be a link with Europe? And do you think there is any chances of having another port in Tripoli? I'm thinking about that because it's very important for Lebanon. Thank you.
Go
I'm
ahead.
going to take those two.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're both Belt and Road related. So let me talk a little bit about the Belt and Road and specifically to the gentleman's point about how the U.S. is responding. The International Expo, yes, could be related to the Belt and Road. I think it's also something else. I think it's also the Chinese leadership saying, we're not just going to be an exporting country, but we're willing to import your products. There's a lot of pressure right now on the Chinese government. Most of it right now is coming from Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is unique, but there's a lot of consensus out there that we need a much tougher approach with China on economic and trade issues. And the narrative here is basically the following. China joined the WTO in 2001. It was maybe the 6th or 7th largest economy. It wasn't sort of exporting the mass amount of products it's doing today. And it received some preferential treatment when it joined, with the promise being that as China's economy continued to grow, it would open its markets to foreign competition and that it would protect companies, foreign companies' intellectual property, and that China would undergo a series of reforms to become much more market-oriented. That was 17 years ago. China has not done that. You know, in many cases, if you want to go in many cases, sectors of the market are just completely shut off to outside competition. Yet in foreign companies or countries around the world, China can participate there. That's why you're hearing this word reciprocity now, much more. Like we want a reciprocal arrangement. In many industries in China, you can go in, but you have to go in and be a joint venture. And then that Chinese partner might take your IP or your technology. There's cyber theft. The U.S. business community was a huge advocate for a constructive U.S.-China relationship for many years. Right now, they're very soured on the Chinese because many of them had intellectual property stolen through cyber means. Now, that may sound hypocritical from an American, given Edward Snowden and all of that, those revelations, but he wasn't talking about that. He was talking about espionage, talking about governments listening in on other governments, which China does very well, by the way. But what European countries do, what America doesn't do, what we don't do, is use the state, use the government to steal companies' intellectual property. And China did that in significant ways. And so now China is the second largest economy in the world. And they'll be the first largest economy in the world by 2030, according to some reports. And so what the international community is saying is China needs to do what it said it was going to do: open its markets, reform its economy, protect intellectual property. Don't allow your industrial policies to disadvantage foreign companies. And Trump is coming forward doing it his way. I don't agree with the way Trump does it, It's weird because he focuses on the bilateral trade deficit, which 99.9% of the economists will tell you is not a good metric for measuring, a bilateral economic relationship. He's also using tariffs, which most free traders, including myself and a lot of Republicans, don't like him using tariffs. They hurt American consumers. They hurt American companies. But what he's done is he's gotten the attention of the Chinese leadership like never before. And I have European ambassadors coming up to me in Beijing saying, I hate Trump. And I don't like that he's levied tariffs, steel and aluminum tariffs on us. But I wish him luck with the Chinese, because if the Chinese open their economy and protect intellectual property, it'll benefit all of us. Now, I don't know how this will turn out, but I think that's what the import exhibition was all about, showing the world that it's going to open itself to foreign products and foreign companies. And the response by the international community was, okay, we'll wait and see. I mean, we've been down this road before. On the Belt and Road, the Chinese are aware that it has created pushback around the world in the way that it was being done. And they're also aware of concerns about debt trap diplomacy and lack of transparency, not including labor and environmental concerns, lower standards on how to do investment and infrastructure and all the rest. And many countries have started to back out of deals, like Malaysia backed out of a $20 billion project, Pakistan economic corridor, $60 billion, they're reevaluating that. So what Chinese government now is trying to do is downplay the Belt and Road. It's realized that it's kind of been a little too much, too quickly. And so they're trying to downplay it. And I think in your discussions with the ambassador, that was part of that. This is not a strategy to take over the world. This is simply an effort to build infrastructure. And the line that they use is, this is about infrastructure, it's not about geopolitics. And it's an initiative, it's not a strategy or some strategic plan to take over the world. And on your other questions, I don't know, to be honest, about Haifa. I don't really know about the port here. I did hear that the Chinese were looking around at the port in Tripoli. But a friend of mine who's here at the conference also told me that nothing actually came to fruition around that. So I don't know about specific projects in that kind of detail.
Hi, my name is Karal Soufi. I just want to ask you a question about reconstructing Syria. And since China is one of the few countries that have the cash to invest in reconstructing Syria, don't you think it's one of its main objective right now, since Syria has a strategic location in the Middle East, and it can also serve the One Belt, One Road initiative?
I think you're exactly right. And I think the Chinese will be very interested to see what they can do. In fact, I read a report that there was a trade fair of sorts that took place in Syria recently. They didn't have it over the last 6 or 7 years, obviously, because of the conflict. But they just had it recently, and China was there, apparently, in a fairly large delegation. They've already indicated they want to build steel factories and power plants and do other projects. But I think this is something that is right in the sweet spot for the Chinese. Plus, they'll be able to look as though they're contributing to the reconstruction and to something positive in the region. So I think my sense is that they will find that very interesting.
Hi, my name is Maher Saloom. I'm American Lebanese, a researcher. Paul, as we all have witnessed lately, the Chinese are investing totally or immensely in Eastern Africa markets as such, like Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. And they have been investing on, let's say, vis-a-vis some failure or diplomatic failure by the US administration since even George W. Bush until now. So economically, there's a race or a war between both super giants, the US and the Chinese. You mentioned until 2030, it could be. Before that, the Chinese will lead economically globally. But how would you foresee such a race, actually, politically and diplomatically, according to the economic agenda of Mr. Donald Trump, let's say the weirdo, I guess? Thank you so much.
Right. No, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, there's a lot of anxiety in the U.S. about the Belt and Road Initiative. And frankly, I mean, people see it as something very strategic, which, if done well, could significantly enhance China's geopolitical position in the world. My own view on this is, in one of the things that it's addressing is infrastructure. There's a huge gap in capital to address infrastructure. China's efforts cannot accommodate all that's required. And if we're really worried about it, we should have our own. We should have our own initiative to put forward to show that, we've got something to put forward that's frankly better. That's the way, in my view, it'll be better for the world. But I don't see any advantage in, directly opposing the Belt and Road Initiative. We ought to, as best we can, call for transparency in projects and sustainability and all the high standards that we think are important. Where we can collaborate and they have and Chinese are using high standards and transparency, we should work with them. Where they're not, I think we should not. The problem from an American standpoint is we're not putting up anything to compete with it. There was some this summer that were announced, and when they announced the dollar amounts, the Chinese foreign minister said there supposed to be another zero at the end of that, as a joke. But I just don't, China's playing that game and they're playing it well, and there's a lot of countries that are interested in it. Now, it'll be very important to China how it's implemented. And if it does cause countries to continue to go into debt, have to give up, strategic ports and other assets, control over to the Chinese, if they bring in all of their workers and that causes domestic problems in those countries, that's not going to be appreciated. If their projects are carried out with no regard for the environment, then it's a brand for China, and they need to care how it's implemented. Otherwise, the brand won't be a good brand. It's a brand for China, and they need to recognize that. And I thought it was interesting. I heard at the WTO that there was some discussion around this idea of debt trap diplomacy, and there was going to be some discussions apparently with the Chinese. I didn't see what ultimately came out, but I do get the sense the Chinese are willing to learn as they make mistakes, and that will be key to their success on this, and this is new for them also. This is not something that they have a lot of experience in doing. What the Chinese say, it's very different. In the U.S. government, when you come up with a huge initiative that affects the entire globe, you have to put the plan together A to Z, cross all the T's, dot all the I's. You go through questions and answers. What potential questions might you get? You're supposed to have it all, buttoned up. The Chinese announce a concept. I think that's similar to the woman in the back was getting to. They announce the concept, and then over time, they flesh it out. And they do what's called crossing the river by feeling the stones. And what they'll tell you on the Belt and Road is we're still crossing the river and feeling the stones. We're learning as we go. And so the question is, will they be able to integrate what they're learning and take it into account? And the last thing I'll say is, in Africa in particular, this year in September, they had the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and they donated a total of $60 billion, which was the same amount as 3 years prior, which is interesting. The number had been going up. This year it stayed the same. And when the announcement came out that it was $60 billion, the Chinese social media lit up. And there was a lot of comments around this idea, why are we contributing to a nation that has poor people? We have poor people here at home. Those are arguments that we've had to deal with in the United States and many of your countries had to deal with here. So this will also become an issue for China, and it'll be interesting to see how they handle that aspect of it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all, and please join me in thanking Paul for his brilliant presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.